Hello, everybody. Good to see all of you. This is an impressive turnout. I'm pretty excited. I'm John Baumgartner. I'm the director of the USGS New England Water Science Center. It looks like we have close to 100 partners here, representatives from each of our 6 New England states that we serve, as well as several of our sister federal agencies. So again, thank you guys for turning out today. Today's presentation is an analysis of last year's drought and is a perfect example of the importance of long-term, robust data sets to understand extreme events. These data were made possible because of the long-term cooperative and collaborative partnerships we have with all of you. And even though the almost 200 data collection sites used in this analysis were established with a variety of cooperators for a variety of reasons, from measuring inflows to a community's reservoir, to understanding nutrient loads to Long Island Sound, to better our understanding of the effects of climate change, we're able to work with all of you to leverage a cohesive data collection network made from the disparate parts. The mission of the USGS is to provide scientific information to the public, those of you making regulatory and management decisions for our communities. It is our hope that the information presented today meets your needs and accomplishes that mission. So with that, I'll get out of the way and happily turn it over to the experts. So Pam, Janet, and Deanne, please take it away.
Thank you, John. I'm Pam Lombard, and I want to thank everybody for coming. We're going to get right to the presentation in a minute. I just want to say there's quite a few people on the call, so we are going to try to mute everybody, and we will take time for questions at the end. You can put questions in the chat during the call, and you can raise your hand at the end after we're done with the presentation. I also want to note that we are recording the presentation, and so it will be available for folks later. And I'm going to share my screen. Okay, can folks see the presentation?
Yes, we can, Pam. Thank you.
Great. So we're presenting today work we've done to document the 2020 drought in New England. And I want to just say up front, it was a collaborative effort among folks in the New England Water Science Center. And you'll be hearing from myself and co-authors Janet Barclay and Deanne McCarthy today. Also got a lot of support from Rick Kaya, head of data collection, New Hampshire and Vermont, and Matt, who you've heard. He's going to be doing the moderating, our deputy director, the New England Water Science Center, but a number of other folks also helped with this effort, and so want to just call out all of them as well. So the report we published, we put it out online in December, and you should be able to just Google New England USGS 2020 Drought of New England. And unfortunately, our pub center seems to be down this morning, so you can't do it right now, but after we can let folks know when that, you can just keep trying it, see when it becomes available. I will say, if you got the link a while ago, we have put out a new version as of this morning. And so if you've downloaded, I encourage you to go and download a new version. It's just a few minor changes, but worth getting the latest draft. And I'll also say that so when you go to the website to get the report, you can link to the PDF for the report, and some of the figures might appear a little bit small. So there's also links directly to a few of the figures. So you would be able to download those and zoom right in on those. So we're on version 1.1, but that would take you directly to that report. It should be pretty seamless. And I want to say that this is a report to document the drought and to do a little summary stream flow statistics and some graphs and show the data. And it's pretty limited in-depth analyses. We're trying to do a snapshot of a single season, the 2020 drought. If this drought were to continue and be a multi-year thing, we might do more in-depth analyses and antecedent conditions. But for this report and this presentation, it's a snapshot of what we saw just this last summer. So drought is notoriously hard to define. There's so many components to it. There's the spatial extent. Are we talking about a drought in northern Maine, all of New England, all of the Northeast, the intensity, the magnitude, the duration, a single month versus a multi-year drought? It can affect different components of the hydrologic cycle or the system and impacts. I'll talk about that in a minute. but it's hard to characterize. It's hard to know when it begins and hard to know when it ends. And we struggled with this with the 1999 to 2002 drought and struggle with it again, how to best define that. Types of drought, most of you are pretty familiar with this, but just quickly, there's a number of different, types of drought, and oftentimes they'll interact or we'll have multiple. I would say the 2020 drought encompassed portions of all of these. The meteorological drought is below average precipitation. Agricultural drought is the below average soil moisture in a time that it matters to the farmers and results from the meteorological drought. Hydrologic drought is below average stream flow and groundwater, and that is what we're talking about today. That's what this report is about, and that is what our presentation is about, and specifically the USGS records of stream flow and groundwater. There's the ecological drought. How does the low water affect ecosystems? And socioeconomic drought. How are water supplies and the public people affected by it, which we won't be going into either. Someone it seems to not be on mute. If you could mute. Another thing I'm going to mention is drought declarations. A number of you are all on your state drought task forces and are very familiar, but these differ widely by states, the different criteria, the different levels of drought. This is not what we're talking about. This is not what this report is about. A number of our gages, our stream flow data, our groundwater data can go into the different levels of drought and the different criteria states use, but we specifically won't be going into that as a part of this work. And I'm going to talk just briefly about flash drought because I think there's so much confusion about what is a flash drought. I mean, as recently as last month, NOAA and the National Drought Mitigation Center had a workshop on, how do we define flash drought? How's the media using flash drought? How are people using flash drought in the literature? And I think it's still a little bit up in the air. I think everybody agrees that it means rapid onset and rapid intensification. But what are the indicators that are most often used to define a flash drought? Is it evapotranspiration or soil moisture? And just for the purposes of this work, we just decided, okay, we're going to choose a definition, and we're going with the U.S. Drought Monitor definition. So the U.S. Drought Monitor has different classifications from abnormally dry to severe drought to extreme drought. And they define a flash drought as a 2-category worsening over 4 weeks or a 3-category worsening over 8 weeks. And so that's the definition that we're working with here. And given that definition, we identified 2 areas of New England that experienced flash drought in last summer. So if the first would be the northern and northeastern portion of Maine. The beginning of June, there really wasn't any drought identified by the Drought Monitor. And by the beginning of July, that northern Maine and northeastern Maine was in moderate to severe drought up in the northernmost portion. So that classified as a flash drought. Likewise, southeastern Massachusetts, northern Rhode Island, and northeastern Connecticut was abnormally dry at the end of July and then was in a severe drought by the end of August, so also classified as a flash drought. I am not going to spend a lot of time on meteorological conditions. We didn't analyze this data, and this is not data that we collect, so a shout out to the folks that did. It's just sort of background information to get our heads back into where we were at last summer and the conditions leading up into it. So this is Maine Cooperative Snow Survey, data collected and maps put out by the USGS in cooperation with Maine Geological Survey. And these maps that I have snapshots of are water content compared to the last 10 years. So they're just sort of above average, below average compared to the last 10 years. So if you look at January, the beginning of January 2020, we were below average in a good portion of Maine, especially northern and down eastern Maine. By February, northern Maine had sort of moved to more normal conditions, and then by March and into April, we were actually above average in terms of water content in northern Maine, which is interesting. That's one of the areas that experienced the flash drought, while down east and southern Maine were in the below average conditions in the lowest 10 to 25% of water in terms of water content. And then moving to New Hampshire, thank you to DES. This is data that they have put out there, below average snow water content from January to March 2020, and that's over a period of 25 to 70 years of record. So definitely noted that below average snow water content conditions. In terms of temperature, and once again, this is not all inclusive. These are a few records that NOAA had put out there, and just for context, so Maine, the warmest summer on record. Portland, Maine, experienced July had the warmest month ever on record. Southern Maine, 4 degrees above normal in July, and notably Burlington and Vermont, temperatures stayed above 60 degrees for 41 days. For rainfall, just a couple of snapshots. This is Concord. Total rainfall was 8.73 inches, which was 8.67 inches below normal. And part of the story with the rainfall is, we were well below normal for this whole summer season from May 1st to the end of September. But it was these periods with almost no rain. So 42 days, from mid-May to mid-June with a 1/4 inch of rain. Or September here, the month of September, 31 days with a 1/4 inch of rain. If it hadn't been for that storm at the very end of September would have set all kinds of records. So I think, that made it particularly acute for farmers, these periods of pretty much nothing. Another snapshot, this is Hartford. Total rainfall was 8.15 inches, and that was 12.54 inches below normal. And so now I'm going to move to the hydrologic component of the drought and pass it off to Janet.
Thanks, Pam. So yeah, from a hydrologic perspective, one of the key drivers of this drought were those extended periods of little to no rain during the summer. And so to illustrate this, we wanted to highlight 2 pairs of stream gauges and wells along with nearby precipitation. And the first pair is in Connecticut, so they're mapped there in the red and blue circles. Next, thanks. And so what we're looking at here in the blue bars is daily precipitation measured at Hartford's Brainerd Field, which is just on the south side of the city. And then the black line is the cumulative departure from normal measured for the water year. So starting back in October of 2019, how the cumulative precipitation has compared with normal years. And so in the beginning of, and that's mapped on or graphed on the right hand axis. And so at the beginning of May, we're starting with a precipitation surplus of about 4 inches, but that declines steadily with a little bit of a bump up from that early July rainstorm, but pretty much declines steadily to the end of September, where we finish the water year with a precipitation deficit of about 5 inches. And the stream gauges and wells responded about as you might expect. And so the red line here is daily stream flow in the Salmon River, and the blue line is groundwater levels at a well in Marlborough, Connecticut. And this well happens to have real-time daily groundwater levels. The red and blue shading in the background in the lower figure are the normal range, so the 25th to 75th percentiles of stream flow in red and groundwater levels in blue. And as you might expect with precipitation patterns that we see in the top figure, the stream flow and the groundwater levels in May at the left end of that figure are at or above normal ranges, and by late September, they're both below the normal range. Now, it's important to note that stream flow and groundwater levels typically decline during the summer months, and you can see that from the fact that the red and blue shading in that lower figure slope downward from May through September. But the decline in 2020 was steeper than normal for both of them. The second pair of sites that we wanted to highlight is in Maine. So next slide. And so here we are looking at, again, we have the precipitation in the blue bars, and this is in Dover, Foxcroft at the wastewater treatment plant. And the black line, again, is the cumulative water year precipitation departure from normal. As with what we were seeing for Hartford, there is a surplus of precipitation in early May. Here it's on the order of 2.5 inches, and it declines pretty steadily to a deficit of about 4 inches at the end of September. This particular site happens to have a little bit of a plateau in that decline through July and August, but the overall pattern is the same. On the bottom, in the red, we're looking at stream flow in the Piscataqua River near Dover-Foxcroft, and groundwater levels in blue at a well in Millinocket. And again, we see that in May, here the stream flow and groundwater levels are well within the normal range of average conditions, and by later summer, August, September, they're both below average. Next slide.
Okay, so getting into the sites used. So we ended up going with 76 stream gauges with at least a 30-year period of record. And you can see those by the black triangles in the site map there. And a 30-year period of record is usually a minimum we want to look at for a drought analysis. There will be a few certain sites that we will get into that will go into the more period of record long-term statistics for some of those. And for our streams, we wanted sites that were generally, not affected by dams or withdrawals and such. For our groundwater sites, we ended up going with 121 wells. You can see with this gray circles on the site map. We ended up picking a 25-year minimum period of record for these sites instead of a 30-year period of record, because we would have really eliminated certain regions in New England, specifically Maine, Vermont, and several wells in Connecticut if we went with the 30-year minimum record. So for our groundwater wells that we chose, they were typically pretty shallow depth wells up to about 110 feet deep. And we excluded wells that were finished in bedrock, so they're not typically very suitable for drought analysis. For the wells, a little more than half of the wells we ended up going with, we collect just periodic, typically monthly data at these sites. Field staff just collect one measurement. And then a little less than half of those wells, we have continuous data similar to our stream gauge network. So in order to try to get those two wells to compare with each other and use all that data, we would use those monthly measurements typically. And if a continuous site did not have a monthly measurement for a certain month, we would use the typical day of the month, the mean daily water level that well might have been measured for that month. Okay, and then back to Janet.
Great. So for the next section of the presentation, we're going to be presenting results of our analysis of these surface water sites and groundwater sites all across the region. And so we're going to start with the surface water sites, and we're going to start at the regional level and then kind of gradually focus in. And so before we look at some data, I want to orient you to this graph. And so we're going to be looking at the regional average 7-day stream flow percentiles. And so that means that we take the average stream flow from the prior 7 days at each of those stream gauges that Deanne described, and we calculate the percentile over the last 30 years. And so a percentile of 100 means that it's the highest that stream flow has been at that site in the last 30 years on that day of the year. And a percentile of 0 means it's the lowest it's been on that day. And then we average those percentiles across all the gauges to get a region-wide picture. The gray shaded area in the middle is the average conditions, percentiles between 25 and 75. Above that is wetter than average, and below that is drier than average. Next, Pam. And even in normal years, there is substantial variation in stream flow. And for example, these are the percentiles from 2012, which was neither particularly wet nor particularly dry. Next. And so this is the data from 2020 mapped in red. And through late May, the stream flow across the region was well within the normal range before declining to below normal in June. And then stream flow recovered slightly in July and then dropped down again in August and September. It's important to note that the increase we see in July was not an increase in absolute stream flow. These are percentiles, and so what we're seeing is an increase in stream flow relative to stream flow in prior Julys. Next, overall, the stream flow ranged from a high of the 75th percentile in early May to a low of the 6th percentile in late September. One question that's come up a few times is how 2020 compares to 2016. And so what you're seeing now is the 2016 data plotted in blue. And one notable difference is that between 2020 and 2016 is in May, where in 2016 stream flow was at the lower end of average or below average during May, whereas in 2020 it was at the upper end of the average conditions. So this is the regional picture, but of course conditions varied across New England. Next. So this is the same figure that we were just looking at, and we're now going to zoom into some of the spatial patterns, and starting with July. And so each circle in this map is a gauge that we analyzed, and they're colored by the average stream flow percentile during the month, with blue indicating above average and red indicating below average, and the inverted triangles indicating 30-year lows. The watersheds, which for this analysis were the Huck 6 basins, that have 4 or more gauges are colored by the average percentile of the gauges within that watershed. And during July, we see substantial variation across the region, with areas well below average, particularly northern Maine, where including some 30-year lows, and other areas with average or even in a few places above average stream flow. The spatial patterns throughout the rest of the summer tell a similar story to what we saw with the regional averages. Stream flows were at or slightly above normal in May, below normal in June with a few 30-year lows, mixed in July, and dry in August and September with many 30-year lows in September. The focus of this study was May through September, but we have received a few questions on hydrologic conditions in the winter and spring of 2020, so want to kind of touch a little bit on that. So this figure extends the regional plot that we've been looking at. So we've seen May through September of this plot, but just kind of extends it back to January. And if you focus on the red line, the 2020 data, you'll see that stream flows in the early part of 2020 were well within the normal range and average conditions. Looking spatially, we see the same basic thing. In that early part of 2020, January through April, stream flows were mostly in the normal range, the yellow color of those circles, with some areas of higher stream flows, the blues, or lower than average stream flows, the spots that have orange circles. To wrap up the surface water analysis, we wanted to focus in on conditions at a couple more sites across the region. Next slide. So the first site is the Smith River near Bristol, New Hampshire. The gray spaghetti lines in the background are the 7-day stream flows for every year in the period of record. And so there's one line for every year. This site has been running for more than 100 years. It was started in 1919, and so there's a lot of lines there. We've highlighted 2 of them, 2016 in blue and 2020 in red. And as we've seen with a lot of the other figures we've looked at so far, stream flow at this site, that red line was in the normal range in May. That red line's in the middle of all the gray ones for May. But then it declines, and by the end of the summer, it's towards the bottom of all the gray lines. Next slide. This slide shows similar plots for 3 other sites. So the top left is the Smith River that we were just looking at. The top right is the Pawcatuck River at Wood River Junction in Rhode Island. Bottom left is Green River at Williamstown, Massachusetts. And the bottom right is the Moose River at Victory, Vermont. And each of these sites are unique, but they all tell a very similar story. We have stream flows in the normal range in May and dropping to well below normal in the later summer, August and September. You'll notice that the Pawcatuck River site on the top right, the stream flows remained in the normal range later into the summer. They don't start dropping until early August, which is consistent with conditions elsewhere in Rhode Island. They seem to, it dried out a little later there. Two of these sites, the Pawcatuck River on the top right and the Moose River on the bottom right, had period of record lows in the 7-day stream flows. And both of these records were sites were started in the 1940s, and so they span many of the historic drought periods.
Okay, so we're gonna look at the groundwater conditions now. So water levels across the region. You're gonna see some similar plots to what Janet was showing for the stream flow. So this plot here is showing our water levels from May through September, which you can find in the report at the 121 wells we looked at. So each individual circle is a well, and then we are coloring the watershed stats in the background if there's sufficient data. So, in this, for our groundwater wells, it's important to notice that in Maine and much of Vermont, we actually do not have enough wells to calculate these watershed stats with at least a 25-year period of record. But you can see from region-wide, levels were pretty normal coming into May and June, with yellow shading representing our normal range of 25 to 75th percentile, but quickly declined through September, which is not untypical for groundwater levels to decline during the growing season, but we just had a much faster rate of decline in 2020, with several record lows. You can see in September, 61% of the monthly groundwater levels for the month of September were below normal, and 3 wells in Rhode Island were dry, so the water level was below our depth of our well. So next. Okay, so again, similar to what Janet was showing, we wanted to look back at where were we heading into this drought season. So in January of 2020, wells were generally, the water level was within the normal or above normal range. You can see a lot of blue individual wells in there. And that's pretty consistent, through May or so, until water levels start to decline rapidly. And something interesting to point out is the Cape Cod region, even into September, a lot of wells there remained above average or within average, likely due to the high water levels that we had there in January and February. There's some record highs, 25-year highs rather, you can see with the black squares. So next. So again, we just wanted to kind of point out a few individual wells across the region and how how the water levels looked based on the period of record at these sites, and kind of compare with the 2016 water levels. So here we're looking at water level below land surface at this well in Coventry, Rhode Island from May through September. And the red line is our 2020 water levels, our monthly water levels, and the blue line is the 2016 monthly water levels. And then all the gray lines in the background are the years for the period of record. So you can see here in May, our 2020 water levels were coming in relatively normal within the middle of the pack there, and quickly started to decline to even below 2016 levels, with our period of record low at this site is now at the end of September in 2020. So next. So here's a few more wells across the region. Up in the left corner is what we were just looking at in Coventry, Rhode Island. In the right corner, we have a well in Wichita, Maine. And the bottom left, we have a well in Scotland, Connecticut. And the bottom right, we have a well in Windsor County, Vermont. So a similar story here. Where water levels are generally, within the normal range coming into May, and they're quickly declining to, generally even below some of the 2016 levels across the region. And for these wells, we're showing record lows for the end of September 2020 were actually recorded at the Coventry, Rhode Island well, as well as the Windsor County, Vermont well. Next.
Okay, so I'm going to talk just briefly about how does 2020 compare to previous droughts. And it's hard to find a metric that you can compare across droughts because, as I said, every drought is so different. You know, what are you going to choose? But since we're looking at the hydrologic component of the drought, we're choosing to look at the surface water and looking at those 76 stream gauges that Janet was showing you, and looking at the 7-day lows for the 30-year period. So for this graph, this is 2020, and this is the percent of those 76 stream gauges that had 30-year lows, and those are the 7-day 30-year lows. And so you can see for June, over 10% of the sites across New England had 30-year lows, and for September it was 20% of the sites that had the 30-year lows. July and August, they are lower, but they also had some record lows in them. This is surface water, so it does respond more quickly to the precipitation that we saw in July and August. And as well, when you start bringing up other years, a couple other years, we've been looking at 2016 for comparison, and 2002. Only 1 year can have the record 30-year low. So 2016 was really known for its low records in July, and so it has relatively more 30-year lows than 2020 does. What this doesn't show so much is how things varied across the region. We have other graphs where we, divide this up by state. It gets a little confusing and it's a little too much to look at. But you would see when you look at that, like 2016 had a higher percentage of lows of stream gauges that had 30-year lows in southern New England and Massachusetts specifically. And 2002 was really known as the drought of record in Maine. And so a higher percentage of those sites that experienced 30-year lows occurred in Maine and in August and September. But this was the metric we chose. Like I said, there's a number of different metrics you could look at. This table is one that we've put in the report, and it's based off of that metric. So we are trying to highlight years that had 30-year lows at 10% of the sites or more. And we're highlighting the months that experienced those 30-year lows. And in cases where it was just a portion of the region, just specific states, highlighted that as well. So there's pros and cons to every different metric. By looking at only the 30-year period of record, which is pretty typical for droughts and low flows, you want to look at the more recent period of record. But then you're missing the 60s drought, which is pretty big in a lot of folks' minds. So just wanted to include that as well. And in that case, and rather than looking at 30-year lows, we looked at period of record lows for that and said that more than 10% of the sites that had a longer period of record experienced a record low in the 60s. And I just a thank you to the USGS field staff that collected over 300 supplemental streamflow measurements and groundwater measurements during the summer of 2020 to document the drought. And this is in addition to all of the measurements that they typically collect. And this was during a pandemic. And just a huge shout out. They're incredibly dedicated. And without their efforts, none of this work to characterize the drought would have been possible. And also wanted to just, feel free to reach out to any of us on the team. Feel free also to reach out to whoever your contact is. If you have a USGS New England Water Science Center contact that comes to your drought meetings, feel free to reach out to them. The data that we're presenting here is folks from all over can answer that, or they can direct you to the person that could best answer that, any questions that you might have. So we will put it out for questions, and Matt will
I'll do my best to moderate. If you're not familiar with Teams, if you look at the top of your screen, there's a little outline of a hand. You can hit that, and that's electronically raising your hand, and I'll try to call on folks in the order in which they hit it. You can also type your questions into the comment box, and a couple of those beat Vicky by a little bit, and so I'll start off with those. So Wayne with New Hampshire DES asks, when you were talking about the averages, is that relative to daily averages or monthly? And I apologize that I didn't catch which figure he was asking that on. But if you want to talk a little bit about how those averages and the comparison to averages were calculated.
Sure, I can talk about that a little bit. So the answer is we did both. So when we were showing the figures of daily stream flow, those 7-day averages, those averages were calculated for each day. When we were showing the maps of stream flow across the region, those were the monthly averages because we were mapping them by month.
Thanks. We did have a question if there were going to be hard copy versions of this report, and no, it's online only. So, Vicky, looks like you had the first hand up.
Sure, thank you. I had a question about the record low graph. It would be really interesting to see which of the record lows were new record loads each time. So that they set a record, in 2002, and then set a record again in, not 2002, 2016, and then set a record again in 2020, because that's one thing we were impressed with, is that we had new records, record lows in both droughts relative to the 60s. So I don't know if you guys have done that or will do anything additional, but that would be interesting. And then the other piece is both National Weather Service and I think Gardner had, during the drought, had mentioned that, the precip deficit wasn't necessarily as much as in the 60s, but there were record lows anyways. And so other factors like, land use change and water use increase and whether that will be looked into. I know this is not the first time I've made this request, but that would certainly, the results of that should certainly lend the states a hand in potentially further making more policy or regulatory changes to those, especially land use, I feel has been neglected as a main contributor to some of these.
Pam, do you want to take the first swing at that one?
Pam, you're on mute.
Janet, could you grab that one? I was fiddling with my screen.
Sure. So in terms of the second question, in terms of land use, we did not do anything with land use. So I'm sure that USGS will be open to conversation about a study related to that in the future, but that was not part of this study. And your other question was about repeated records. And we did look at that a little bit. That didn't end up being part of the focus of this study. We focused here on sort of what the records were at the time that we were analyzing it. So I don't at the moment have, Pam or Deanne might remember, but I don't actually remember how many of the sites had record lows in 2016 and new record lows. I know that there were some that did, but I don't remember how many.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or comments? There we go. Vandana.
Hi, Hi, thank you so much for this talk. I think this is very helpful for us to put it in perspective. My name is Vandana Rao. I'm from Massachusetts. I'm wondering, though, if you are planning to look at the rest of the calendar year. I mean, the drought didn't end in September. October, November, December, at least here in Massachusetts, we certainly saw in October, for sure, conditions that were still drought-like, and we didn't end our drought officially until December. And I'm not sure where the other states are in their drought calls, but I see some of them are still having meetings. So any plans to look at it within the entirety of when the drought actually spanned in these states, as opposed to cutting it off at the end of the water year?
Yeah, I mean, I would say we struggled with where to cut it off. In terms of getting this snapshot out to folks, we chose the end of the water year, which makes sense for us. But yeah, we were certainly tempted to continue and look at it into October and November, and we're constantly looking at that. In terms of putting it into a summary report, there isn't plans for that at the moment. So, but certainly of interest to a lot of folks.
All right, thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Brian. This information looks back. Any ideas on what to expect moving forward? And Brian may be talking about, what are we looking at going into this water year and the next summer season? What we're talking about, looking at the current conditions, and we did look at some of that in preparation for this question, is what Vandana was talking about a little bit. For the purposes of this report, we had to cut our analysis off at some point because we had to, get those records processed and write the report. But we're still out collecting, continuous data and where we're coming into this. And so hopefully the graphs that Pam is showing now, and I'll let her talk about a little bit, help to answer that question.
Pam, do you want to describe this, or do you want me to take it?
Can you take that?
Sure. So we did do a little bit. So after, the report was kind of being finalized, we did run some of the analyses through the end of the calendar year. And we do see, water levels remaining low in October and then recovering, not everywhere, but mostly up through the end of December. We have not run this after December, largely because once we get into January, we have a lot of ice on our streams and things, and so those records need a little bit more processing before they're ready for us to analyze. So we've kind of looked up through the end of 2020, and as I'm imagining folks have seen around, water levels have come up. We don't know what that means for the future.
And I'll just quickly throw up these snow survey sites. So this is water content compared to the last 10 years, last year and this year, according to the most recent snow survey. So water content in the snow is low. Just putting that out there as well. We're in the lowest 10 to 25% compared to the last 10 years as of February 3rd.
Okay, thanks. Hopefully that answers some of your questions, Brian. Jen Peterson came up with a very good point. Boy, this year has not been normal anyways around, not just hydrologically, but due to COVID, we've seen lots of changes in the ecosystems and pollution and traffic, and likely changes also in the patterns of water use. I know that I'm flushing my home toilet a lot more than I'm flushing my office toilet over the past 10 months. And so when we're looking at any of these wells or stream flows that might be impacted by water use, there could be changes in that as well. As I think it was Deanne pointed out early in the presentation, we tried to choose wells and stream gauge sites that were minimally impacted by anthropogenic effects, but certainly not completely. And so all of those things would be worth looking into. This was a snapshot based on our data. We would love to be turned loose to look at this in a lot more detail. Okay, Barry Maurer said, how do stream flows in the years 2010 through 2020 compare to earlier decades in general? I don't know if, Pam, if you and your team looked at this question specifically, knowing Janet, she probably has an R script that could pull this up quickly, but I don't know if we have an answer for that. Do we?
Yeah, so, I don't have an answer for that ready to go yet.
Yeah.
I don't either. I think that some others have looked at that question, but we didn't include it in this study.
I don't know if any of the other USGS folks, or heck, anybody on the call might have an answer to that. Gardner, if you have any of that in from Gardner Bent as our surface water specialist. If you do the subtraction to 30 years, as they mentioned, this isn't catching, some of those low periods, the droughts of the 1960s, and some of those other periods specific to that 10-year period, for the 30 years or the 25 years for groundwater levels. I'm not sure, but that's something that we could certainly look at. Any other questions or hands? We've got you for another 11 minutes, and I plan to use every one of those minutes. Yes, Vandana.
I just wanted to maybe add to what you just said. In Massachusetts, both for the 2016-2017 drought as well as for the one we recently had last year, when we would look at the data, we would also present to our task force if there were any record lows, just so that we can start to get a sense of the severity of the conditions at these at our various gauge sites. And we certainly saw several. So when we say records, let me say some of these records go back to before the 60s. And so I don't know if from a decadal point of view how that compares decade to decade, but we certainly, both last year and most definitely 2016, 2017, saw several record lows. So does that mean as a decade-wise it's much worse? Hard to say. I think we'll need to look at the data, but it was something quite concerning for us to see so many record lows across the state.
Yeah, at certain points we did look at period of record lows, and like I said, you just lose a lot of the geographic representation. We just don't have enough gauges to look at that for the entire region, but we certainly set record lows for the entire periods of record, some of them going back, 50, 70 years in some cases.
Okay, thanks. Next hand up, Zhang-Kai Li from Rhode Island.
Hi. I just have a question, a follow-up question from Matt's comment of water use. I was wondering if you have any plan to look into the potential impacts of this drought condition on the water quality of surface water and groundwater. Can talk from the influence of drinking water, source water protection perspective, and beach recreational water function, as well as aquaculture, etc.
That is a great question, and here in our Water Science Center, we had biweekly drought calls throughout the summer, and we, admittedly, a lot of the focus is on the water quantity aspect, and when you're in the midst of a drought, but that water quality aspect and drought is really interesting because we've seen that there are temporal aspects to water quality, and certainly droughts can exacerbate those. We have our environmental hydrology section chief on the call, Joe Ayotte, who has specifically done studies looking at drought and arsenic across the country and in the region. Joe, if you're actually listening and not just doing email while I'm talking, would you like to weigh in and maybe say a couple of words about water quality and climate and drought?
Sure, I am listening. And we have done quite a bit of work on that topic recently. In particular, I can point you to a couple of papers that I could share. One recently, we looked at the impact of national scale drought on the likelihood of having high arsenic in private wells. Mm-hmm. And it showed some interesting things. We saw probably half again as many people exposed under what could be considered, plausible drought impacts for the nation as we did under normal conditions. And that was a paper by Melissa Lombard in our section, which I'll share with you. Okay. Also, we've done, so that's kind of national scale model driven. At the more local scale, we've studied 3 wells in southeast New Hampshire, a private domestic well, a public bedrock aquifer well, and a public sand and gravel well, and monitoring those for over 5 years, bi-monthly sampling for a host of groundwater contaminants, looking at seasonal variability and drought impacts, because we went through a drought period during that monitoring. We saw some rather remarkable changes in water quality, which we've documented pretty well, including impacts related to the capture or not capture of shallow aquifer water by the deep aquifer wells. And those kinds of things make a big difference in terms of geochemical equilibrium, and that changes in geochemical equilibrium really impact contaminants and contaminant transport. So I'll share those with you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
So before we get to Bill Sheehan's question, I want to circle back to Brian's question. Somebody chatted me that said I might have misinterpreted it. And that's looking into the future. So maybe not just into the next, the rest of this water year, but as far as forecasting goes with stream flow and groundwater levels, I'll say that a couple of our scientists here in New England worked with some scientists in our West Virginia Water Science Center to look at forecasting using our data and our data networks. And that was essentially using regression equations and coming up with probability maps for the summer months based on these current conditions or last month's conditions, say March conditions. What are the probabilities that we're going to be in that lower 25th percentile? And we ran that as a pilot study. It's actually published, the methodology for it, and it's very promising. There would just need to be a lot more tweaking and probably a lot more sorting out before it was really functional and useful. But that is definitely something that we're looking at. And we've seen that during the state drought meetings, that we're presenting the current conditions and last month's conditions and the last 6-month conditions. But the question is always, what's it going to be tomorrow? I know that our friends with the National Weather Service and NOAA, nobody cares if it's going to snow yesterday. They care if it's going to snow or rain tomorrow. And we want to be able to assist in that forecasting for these hydrologic conditions. And where we have these long periods of record, we can, we never, we're not the experts on if it's going to be a continued dry summer or not. But we can certainly look at our hydrologic records and our wells and our stream gauges and say, boy, there's a 75% chance this is going to get worse before it gets better. And that is something that we are definitely looking at. So hopefully maybe that answers your question a bit more completely, Brian. So we have a question from Bill Sheehan. And this is a snowpack question. Does snowwater equivalent in the snowpack necessarily correlate with groundwater levels later in the year, or are there conditions that may affect this? Wondering about depth of frost, frozen conditions of the ground during snow melt, a lot of other things. And the short answer, I will say, before hopefully getting rescued by somebody who understands snowpack processes a little bit better than me, absolutely. I mean, of course, that reservoir of water that's used and pretty extensively as a reservoir can be impacted by the meteorological conditions that are upcoming. Does it all melt at once? Does it stay frozen? Does it get Does it get transpired? Would somebody like to jump in and explain how those conditions can impact what happens to all that water that's stored in the snowpack? There's got to be an expert on the line. So their question was specifically concerning, the frost and the frozen conditions that we're going to see in our northern climates, a lot more than we would see probably in Mass, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. Bob?
Hey, Matt, you want me to take a shot at it?
Yeah, take a shot at it.
I am Bob Lent. I'm the Associate Director for Data. I've been in Maine since Maine was part of Massachusetts, I think. Snowpack, midwinter snowpack is absolutely the best predictor of the following year's stream flow and groundwater levels. It is not very precise, though. In other words, if you have a big snowpack, you have a potential for a big recharge. You have a potential for a big spring runoff, but you won't necessarily have either. Probably the biggest concern, other than antecedent conditions, including whether or not the ground is frozen, is how quickly the snow melts, and does it melt by itself slowly where there's a lot of evapotranspiration, or does it melt quickly due to a precip event? If you have a large precip event, you're going to have a big spring runoff, and you might have a lower groundwater recharge. So while a big snowpack is a good indicator of the potential for a big groundwater recharge or a big spring runoff, it is not a guarantor of either one, and it is probably not a guarantor of both of them, if that makes sense.
So thank you, Bob. We're right at 1 o'clock. We want to cut it off and let people get back to their day. If there are other questions that we didn't get to, or that you think of any, especially once you start combing through the report, please don't hesitate to reach out to Pam, Jen, and Deanne. You can always get your question to me, and I'm kind of like a point guard. I then distribute it to somebody who can answer it more fully. I'll say that we focused a lot on our really great long-term groundwater and surface water networks, and a lot of you are familiar with those because a lot of you are paying for them, and we can't stress our appreciation for that enough. We also have some really wonderful long-term water quality information, especially in the surface water in Connecticut and Rhode Island, and we're continuing to build that network in Massachusetts. We also have some good long-term and in a few places continuous water quality information of the groundwater, which is a little bit more unique. And all of those are possibly available for further analysis. With that, if there's no other information, I will let you go. I am going to post a PDF of these slides into this meeting chat, so you'll have it. Also, this meeting is being recorded, and that may automatically show up in the chat, and you're welcome to share that. I don't think we said anything too heinous or misspoke too badly. And with that, again, I want to state my appreciation for everybody, not just for joining us, but for helping and providing your expertise at these meetings. Flood and drought are good for us for business, but they are tough on all of you state employees and and you decision makers. And so let's hope for a normal water year, whatever that is. And but chances are we'll be talking drought here in the next few years. And so let's not waste a good crisis and see if we can solve some of these problems and before the next one comes.
And Matt, I just want to say, I want to encourage folks to share the report. And if there's anyone else who you think would benefit from a presentation like this, we are open to presenting it to other folks as well.
And during this presentation, we got word that the publication's website is back up. And so that report that at the beginning Pam said was inaccessible is now available for you to go download.
How about that?
Excellent.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.